good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the country. If you wouldn't mind just letting others in the virtual room, let us know who you are and where you're coming from in the chat. Make sure that that is set to everyone. If you do have a comment or question, there's also the option to send that to just the panelists or the host. My name is Erica McCray, and I'm so delighted that you all chose to join us for our first in a series of joint webinars from the Cedar Center and UCEA. Today's topic is Eyes Wide Open Leadership, Overview of National Issues Impacting the Principalship. So as I mentioned, this is a joint webinar series we are kicking off, and the title of the series is Supporting Systemic Leadership for All Learners. And we hope that you gain a lot and you will join us for additional webinars. I'm Erica McCray, co-director with the Cedar Center, along with my colleague, Meg Kamman, co-director with the Cedar Center and faculty at the University of Florida. The Cedar Center is directed by Mary Brownell, a distinguished professor here at the University of Florida. Also joined by colleagues David DeMatthews, president of UCEA, as well as faculty at University of Texas at Austin, and Mónica Byrne-Jimenéz, executive director of UCEA and faculty at Michigan State University. Today's objectives are for us to discuss the critical role of leaders in inclusive education, share UCEA's priorities as well as the Cedar Center's, describe the landscape of leadership preparation, highlight resources from Cedar and CCSSO as well as UCEA, and our focus in partnership with CCSSO on inclusive leadership. So we hope you'll have some takeaways today and that you will continue to join us for these discussions. So now I'll turn it over to our colleagues at UCEA.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Dave DeMatthews. We're talking about leadership here, but I want us to focus in a little bit on the role of the principal. Principals really matter, as do superintendents, assistant principals, but principals, as we all know, they're in this very pivotal position between what happens in classrooms, what happens with families and communities, and what happens with school districts and with state and federal policymakers. So they're in this very critical spot, and they make important decisions. They're charged with making important decisions about who they hire, how they induct teachers, how they utilize their budget, curriculum, assessment, instruction, developing master schedules, providing professional development. And these decisions are really impactful for all students, but particularly struggling learners. And there's a great deal of research that really emphasizes just how important principals are. Jason Grissom and his colleagues recently put out a Wallace Foundation report highlighting the critical role that principals play, and when principals are effective at their jobs, the impact it has on student achievement. So there's lots of frameworks for what effective leadership is, lots of different terms, but a more recent review of literature kind of highlighted these 5 leadership domains that I think are really important for grounding the way that we think about what principals can do to support all students. So they establish and they convey a vision. They facilitate high quality learning experiences for students. They build professional capacity. They create a supportive organization and for learning, and they connect with external partners. So those are pretty generic features. They're not very contextualized. You can go to the next slide. And they're not specific to students with disabilities, and they're not specific to students who might be struggling, and they're certainly not specific to how race and gender and class and immigration status and language, these different identity markers mix. And so something that both Cedar Center and CCSSO worked on was nuancing our professional standards, the professional standards in educational leadership, to add greater dimensions for how what effective practice looks like for principals and supporting all students, particularly students with disabilities. And so I'd encourage y'all to look at this document and let it be an important tool that can ground the preparation and the practice of school leaders.
David, I just want to tell everyone how excited I am to be here. I'm really grateful to Meg, Erica, and David for the invitation and for the opportunity to re-engage in this larger conversation around inclusive leadership for each and every child. I think to say just a little bit about UCEA, or University Council for Educational Administration, and we're a consortium of over 112 leadership preparation programs across the country. We're a community of over 1,000 faculty, and I like to say that we impact thousands of educational leaders and tens of thousands of classrooms across the country as well. I think in this conversation, in this thinking through about what is the role of higher education leadership preparation in particular, this idea of confronting ableism, I think, is very very nuanced, I think, to use your word, David, but also very personal. And so I'm going to start with some of that. My father 8 years ago went to sleep one night and woke up and he was paralyzed from the waist down. And it wasn't until that happened that I think I realized how inaccessible the world was every day for people who are differently abled. A former colleague of mine, years ago, who has a child with disabilities, expressed her frustration and how schools kept saying that, kept using the term handicapped student, rather than a student with handicaps. And it wasn't until then that I heard how our language places more value on the handicap than on the person. I think, our recent move here to Michigan State University, MSU has a real clear commitment so that all of our online courses and platforms are accessible. There's an office that's specifically dedicated to that offers trainings and tutorials. And I was recently in one of those webinars, and they showed how color looks different to students with a red-green color blindness. I mean, something as simple as that they showed. And it wasn't until then that I realized that my syllabus with its beautiful color coding was going to be illegible for some of my students. And I say that happening just last week, and I say that knowing that my nephew is red-green colorblind. And I think, that's sort of the personal, but then it's sort of the larger level, most recent statistics in higher education, and those are almost 20 years old now, indicate that only 4% of higher education faculty have disabilities that we know of. And there's approximately 26% of the population. So we have a representation issue in higher education faculty. And to my knowledge, that statistic is probably less than 1% when it comes to educational leadership faculty. And I say these things to highlight that confronting ableism has to be a systemic issue. It has to be an individual, it has to be institutional, and it has to be as I said, sort of systemic, and understanding how these systems all impact each other, and how in the process of engaging in confronting ableism, sort of understanding that there are barriers to doing that. There's resistance at each of these levels, which is why that individual personal, I think, is so important. I think it also highlights the need that within higher education, we have to be constantly aware, constantly reflective, responsive, and I think a word we used a little bit earlier in our conversation is sort of tenacious, this constant, moving the ball forward. I do think, though, that with each need that exists in higher education, there is an opportunity, and that opportunity presents itself. And I think this conversation is at that juncture of that need, of that place that puts higher education, in conjunction with educators and K-12 professionals. And talking about this, I want to sort of rearrange a little bit, because this idea of connectivity is huge for me. It's huge for us at UCEA, and really beginning to recognize that K-12 and higher education are intricately linked. That whatever happens in K-12 is happening in higher ed, and vice versa. So if we talk about issues of food insecurity, we talk about trauma, lack of diversity in leadership, gaps in access to quality learning, and the marginalization of students, families, and communities with disabilities. We talk about it in the context of K-12. We have to talk about it in the context of higher education and the impact that that has on faculty, on the culture of higher ed, and the students' experience. We are a K-20 system, and we have to think about ourselves that way. We have to strengthen those connections. And I think a really important way of doing that is by engaging in these kinds of conversations. I think the other two pieces here, really thinking about how do we recognize, highlight, build adaptive approaches to the preparation of teachers and the preparation of leaders. And how do we make sure that the system between our preparation and the needs of K-12, again, are part of that same, ecology, so to speak. I think, David, you talked about the standards for the P-cell standards. Higher education, leadership preparation has a set of its own standards that parallel almost exactly the professional learning, the professional educational leadership standards, and are also paralleled in it in not having a lot of nuanced understanding of the needs of K-12 inclusive education, and not helping us as program people really think about the nuances of that in our own classrooms, and how we model and how we evaluate and how we build community around the same questions that are existing in K-12. I think that's a big place where we can continue and strengthen that conversation around how do we become a system, an organization that is more responsive and adaptive to the needs of the communities and the children that we serve. I think this last one, again, not terribly innovative in any way, but sort of human-centered systems. Often we put these standards at the center of our system and then try to think about how do we implement them, when in reality, maybe we should be thinking about, let's put the humans at the center of the system and figuring out how our standards meet the needs of those people. Again, K-12, but I'm also talking about leadership preparation and the importance of us being active members in that conversation within our classrooms, within our own cultures as institutions of higher education, and within our programs, and how we as faculty may need to continually retool and get better understandings of what it means in this day and age, in these schools, in the midst of a pandemic, to be a student or a parent or a community member that is trying to represent and advocate for their own child. And so I think part of what drew me to this conversation with Eric and Meg and David and all of you is really about how do we build that K-20 system? How do we make sure that in leadership preparation, we're responsible to the needs of K-12, and how does K-12, also be responsible to the needs of us in leadership prep, and really thinking about how do we make these systems more communicative, more connected, more collaborative over time. Thanks, Erica.
I feel like Mónica just set the foundation for our center and the work that we do. So thank you so much. That's really exactly why we are funded, to do all the things that you just talked about, and within a systems format. I know I saw Erica thinking at it as well. I'd love to know of the people who are here. I'm going to get you typing in the chat pod. How many of you currently work in a CEDAR state or with a CEDAR team? And if you don't work, so in the chat pod, let me know. You can say, oh, I work with the New York team, or I'm working with the Mississippi team. Or if not, have you been to the CEDAR Center website and used any of our resources? I'd love to know who we have. Looks like yes, so we have some people. Mississippi, Washington, Rhode Island, Tennessee, great, Georgia. We have some folks who have used our resources. Great, this is fantastic. We're so glad to have you here. And from CEDAR Central, like Mónica set up for us, we're really thinking about the systems approach, how we're partnering with other people who have this same vision of improved outcomes for students with disabilities. You know, here we are in 2022. I'm not sure I've said that yet in a public forum. And we still have a lot of room for improvement for our students with disabilities, for a lot of students in need, but definitely for our students with disabilities. And the reality is, like, we're all living in our lands of preparation or K-12 or these different areas, but we ultimately have to be working together in a systematic way if we want to be able to impact those outcomes. And so for us, we're thinking about those big areas, the preparation, the policy, the practice, in order to work together across our agencies so that we really can make that difference. Some of the ways, Erica, you can go to the next one. Some of the ways that we do that from the Cedar Center is really thinking about all of those different areas. So you'll see I've highlighted on the right-hand side here, leadership as such an important piece. A lot of people will think, oh, Cedar, they want to improve outcomes for students with disabilities, and that immediately takes people to special education, which of course we need to impact special education. But as you can see from our chart here, there is a lot of pieces in here, and the leadership piece is a really integral one. We cannot impact outcomes for students with disabilities without that leadership piece, okay? Without general ed, without special ed, without all of these focus areas, but we have to have leadership at the table. We have to be impacting leadership if we want to be moving those outcomes. And that's really what we're talking about today. How do we get all of those systems in place from leadership? How do we get that leadership at the table? How are we thinking about educator preparation reform, but within those larger systems, like you talked about, Mónica? How are we connecting and collaborating so that we can make that change? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of that collaboration that we've been at. One of which is a partnership with CCSSO. And so maybe I have some people at the table who are also a part of, I see some Colorado, I see some folks in here from lots. Oh, Kaylin Connolly is with us today. She is our leader of this effort. So shout out to Kaylin there from CCSSO. Who is leading this. This is Advancing Inclusive Principal Leadership. It's a state initiative, and it's a partnership that we have with CCSSO and the Oaks Foundation that CCSSO partners with, really creating this network to deep dive into supporting inclusive schools. And so I want to kind of walk you through a little bit of how their effort really matches and supports some of the efforts that we have going on in states, and helps to build and complement on that. In AIPL, they have 9, I believe it is now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Kaylin, in the chat pod, but 9 strategies that they are working with states on. And 2 of them in particular, if you'll go to the next one, Erica, strategy 3 is transform principal preparation and licensure. And so you'll see here, I highlighted in green this piece about establishing and implementing principal preparation program approval processes and standards. Really thinking about effective, inclusive principal leadership. So if you think about that chart that I showed you originally for us with program approval and program review and how that matched in with leadership, you'll see how it's just a really nice fit for strategy 3. And then also with strategy 4, which is promote principal development on inclusive practices. This one under promoting effective systems of in-service support, evaluation, and professional development for principals at state and local levels. So really thinking about how we're working with our K-12 systems. How does that intersect with our educator preparation programs to make sure that we have those effective systems working together? And thank you, Kaylin, put a link to the 9 state strategies in the chat pod so that you can have those. So all together right now, we are working with quite a few states in leadership. The ones that are in green are the AIPL states. They've had 2 cohorts. So first 4 states, and now they have an additional 5 states that they're working with. And then I also, most of those are also Cedar states. And then in blue, I also highlighted additional Cedar states who are working on principal preparation and systems that are not a part of the AIPL initiative, just so that you can kind of see where we are. So if you're in one of those states, you've probably heard about some of the initiatives that are going on, or would definitely want to link to different things that might be moving forward. But you'll see that there's still a lot of gray states in there. And so those are states that we're not working with right now. Doesn't mean that there's not something going on in leadership preparation, but would love to see more movement in this area in the different systems. I want to give you a couple of examples just quickly of some of the work that we've been doing in states and how that might look different based on the context. So in Colorado, you know, I heard you talking earlier, Monica, about kind of like the different buckets of groups, you know, and how we really needed to make those connections together, focused on students so that we could move forward. And I think that Colorado is a great example of that. They have 12 educational leadership programs in Colorado, but prior to doing this work, they really didn't have mechanisms for them to regularly work together. And so they created a professional learning community of those 12 leadership programs that meet on a regular basis, and they discuss problems of practice. Seems, you know, like not a huge deal, right? But it actually is a big deal, because now all of these 12 programs can be working together and discussing and focusing on the issues that they have in Colorado and how to meet those students' needs through those leadership programs. And the faculty have really found that this has been really beneficial to them in moving their programs forward and in making changes that are really relevant and leveraging and aligning across those programs. So great work happening in Colorado. The other example I want to give you is a AIPL state, and that's Mississippi. So here's an example. I have like a truck going by my office right now. Sorry for the distraction. Mississippi is also a Cedar state and an AIPL state. And so when they started their work originally, really focused in on this common vision and language. So do we even have a common language for inclusive leadership that we can all agree on? And they started their work in aligning their principal preparation with the PSAL standards, just like you had talked about earlier, David, making sure that we have our PSAL standards, that we're addressing that related to students with disabilities. And similar to Colorado, they developed an organization called the Mississippi Education Faculty Association. So allowing an opportunity for their faculty to engage on a regular basis. And that team right now is working on a series of common assessments that all of the preparation programs are going to be using, that allows their leader candidates to show that they have knowledge and practice in inclusive leadership. So all of the universities will be using that. And then one other piece they are working on is they're collaborating with Cedar Shortages team to provide professional development to their administrators in the state on the implementation of high leverage practices and creating inclusive school cultures. So really a lot of work. These are just 2 little snippets of the great work that's going on in 2 of the states. You saw there were 14 of them total, and I wish I could talk to you about them all day long, but I would encourage you, like in the case of Mississippi, there's a case study, which Kaylin will probably throw in the chat pod in a minute for you, so you can have a link to it, where you can learn a little bit more about what the states have going on. So now I'm going to pass the floor, I think, back over to you, Erica. Because you know I could talk all day.
I do. And now we are going to actually talk to each other. So I'm going to stop sharing. For those of you who have joined us, if you have questions, please add them in the chat pod. I am going to pose some questions to our panelists, but would love for you to join in as well. So my first question for you, because we cannot ignore the state of our union, our world for the last couple of years, but what are some issues, and as Mónica said earlier, opportunities that have come up or become more apparent during or because of the pandemic? And anyone can jump at it.
Well, I would say related to leadership, certainly one of the things that has cropped up for us or that we're hearing, of course, has to do with the stress of people in general. And how I think that relates to administrators, obviously, in K-12 is, you know, principals are more stressed out than they ever were. They have more on their plate to deal with than they ever had to deal with. But one of the opportunities of the pandemic too is that like going online or virtual, I think has exacerbated some of the gaps that we've had and has made people think more about addressing inequities in general that exist and how they might address those inequities. So it's brought out more of the problems that we have, which I think is sometimes a good thing, particularly with you know, needing to address students who have specific needs. At least that's one of the things that I've seen.
Meg, I would agree with you on multiple counts. So I do think one of the things I study is principal burnout and principal turnover, because I care about principals creating inclusive schools, and I often see them make progress and then they leave, and then that progress can be removed, it can be eliminated. So it's a topic that's really meaningful to me, and I do feel like a lot of principals are burned out. But also to your point, I'm starting to see when I go back and visit schools, just a stronger recognition of everybody who's working in schools of seeing the whole child, and thinking a lot more carefully and paying a lot more attention to the student's entire experience and their mental health and how they're socializing. And I think that creates a lot of important opportunities moving forward as schools open and stabilize and principals recommit to culture building and instituting new systems. I think there's a great opportunity for inclusive leadership moving forward.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of take it up a notch, right? Because I think, you know, there's a couple of things. One is that, you know, like everyone knows, right? The pandemic highlighted existing inequities and existing gaps in access to quality teaching and learning. And that sort of happened at the higher education level too. Again, I do not absolve us of any of those things, right? And I think one of the things that was highlighted in addition to that is the lack of responsiveness or adaptability of the system itself. Our options really became stay at home and teach online, or go to school and stay socially distant. And again, happened in higher education as well, right? You know, school, I mean, lots of universities started the semester virtually and are coming back face-to-face beginning in February. And I think systems, you know, individuals in the system did a fabulous job of trying to make that transition as meaningful and as human as possible for teachers and students and principals and faculty. But the fact that those were our only two options, I think is an opportunity for us to rethink, period. Like, what is learning? What is teaching? How to create organizations that are much more adaptable, that are much more in some ways organic. You know, I think of sort of the amoeba, where when the amoeba starts moving towards something that's toxic for it, it will move and morph and find another way around, right? And so how do we create organizations that are more organic in that way, more flexible, more adaptable? And that comes from this conversation around like what does it mean to learn and teach? And what does it mean to learn and teach in this context right now? When our, we've spent decades talking about education as being social, how learning is socially constructed, and now we're in a situation where we're isolated. And so how do we overcome that? How do we address that? I think is the biggest opportunity. And I don't know if that includes, AI, or if that includes open classrooms again, or if that includes any host of technologies that are in the process of being created right now, hopefully. I think that would be really powerful. And also, also K-20, right? So all my comments are always going to be K-20. I'm going to stop saying that. But I think that is a huge opportunity that if we let it go by, will be a real unfortunate outcome. And I recognize that we all want to go back to quote unquote normal. And we all recognize that quote unquote normal wasn't good for everybody. And yet here we are going back to normal. And just the opportunity to like think about what could this look like differently. I think I was in a conversation yesterday, and were doing an initiative where they were interviewing authors who do science fiction to think about how they would imagine the schools of the future to be, and how that might help us understand what we can do better now.
Mm-hmm. When you mentioned science fiction, I read Octavia Butler's work, and she foretold a lot of what we are seeing right now. So art imitates life, and life sometimes imitates art. A couple of questions and comments have come into the chat. And Alan Siebel mentioned, why not pre-K 20? I think absolutely. We are also talking about those in the early years in consideration, particularly as it pertains to engaging families and communities.
Yes, my apologies, Alan. You're absolutely right. Pre-K 20. Actually, probably birth to 20, right?
Mm-hmm. Alan also mentioned, certainly our grads who are principals tell us that they are dealing more with SEL issues than learning gaps. So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that.
Well, Monica's been pushing us to think about the system. And I also saw a little, I guess, conversation between Alan and Meg. And I think the system in general, it's not designed to take care of educators, right? So educators are experiencing very high levels of stress. Nowhere in our professional standards for leaders is proactive coping and how to manage all the stress in the job. And so that just gets pushed down onto teachers. And then of course, it gets pushed onto students. So I think, we do really need to think about the entire system here, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of administrators and teachers' mental health so that, they're able to do the same for children. I think if you don't have that in place first, I think all the SEL strategies, they don't go as far as they would if the people working within that system, if the adults are not taken care of first.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think about, I see people writing and saying, well, children are resilient. They are, only as far as the resources and skills that they have available to them will allow them to be. Amanda shared an article related to pandemic stress among principals. Thank you for that. There was a question. Is there a framework that can be embedded in the implementation of MTSSB framework? And I'm not sure if the panelists are clear on what that question is asking, or if David wants to add more. David Fraser, who posted the question.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, I don't know what MTSSB is. I do know about MTSS. And I'm
MTSSB is, some places refer to PBIS as a similar.
I see. Mm-hmm. We have, I think the note about MTSS is part of when we're in principal preparation programs in schools, thinking about the intersection of inclusive practices has to be a part of MTSS implementation. And so I'm not sure there's a framework that fits perfectly within there, but I do think that inclusive leadership practices are a part of MTSS implementation.
Okay, another comment, there's no training that provides or has provided strategies on how to deal with the immediate shifts to virtual learning that was expected. This affected faculty, leadership, and of course, families and students' ability to succeed, which I think you all have touched on.
Yeah, and I mean, if I could also David's done great work on principal burnout. We're all, it's sort of, in the media every day, right? About the challenges in K-12, about the great resignation or the great retirement that is happening, particularly in higher levels of leadership, the superintendent level, which says a lot again about how our system isn't really designed for people. And less so for those most vulnerable in our communities. And again, just to sort of continue to draw the parallel, I think recently this week, there was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, I think, talking about the great disengagement, where faculty in higher education, are not retiring or not moving the way they are in K-12, but they're sort of pulling back from some of their quote unquote service commitments or research commitments or even engagement in program improvement because again, the burnout's is happening pre-K to 20. And I think that's an important thing to recognize as well. And so when we're in our classrooms, working with principals or aspiring principals who are exhausted, you often have faculty that are also doing their best, trying to support their social emotional needs of their students while still also being held to, standards and outcomes. And in ways that are pulling them in multiple directions. And so I think we're just seeing a lot of educators pre-K 20 who are just really, really stretched thin. And I'm not sure, how we, clearly, I think we start by talking about it and recognizing that this is happening. We call out that this is adversely affecting some parts of our communities more than others in education. And so I think, having more thoughtful conversations around how do we recognize, support, and which is what people are doing, but then how do we rethink those very systems that are creating these tensions and these traumas for children and adults alike?
Absolutely. My next question was related to that. What do we need to consider in terms of pathways into leadership so that we're able to attract, prepare, and sustain, knowing that people are taking other options? We will probably have people leaving. People are talking about the great resignation, like you said, the great disengagement. What do we need to do to retool the system to be different? How do we need to reimagine preparation? Because it starts with mostly teachers moving into leadership positions, but if they don't stay in the field, we won't have that pathway. Is that the $1 million question?
It's definitely the $1 million question for sure. We need to value teachers, and with some of the stimulus money, hopefully with families seeing a bit more of what teachers are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, we can have a cultural shift in how we value teachers in this country, because I think we're up against it as enrollment in teacher education programs decline, as teachers burn out. We're looking at some of our aspiring assistant principals being trained right now and hearing the district talking about them being principals in 1 or 2 years, and they only have 2 or 3 or 4 years of classroom experience. That's not a sustainable, healthy model. We're going to have to stabilize the teacher pipeline, and so hopefully at the national and state levels, we can make more sustained investments. And I also think we really do. I mean, I know this is maybe a dream, but we need to tamp down on the polarization and the attacks on public ed and on teachers and on administrators, because a lot of the superintendents and principals and teachers I talk to feel increasingly uncomfortable in their roles, and having families with varying perspectives about COVID, about what CRT and racism and how these things are discussed, that they just don't want to be in that space. And so somehow, some way to improve school leadership, district leadership, these systems, we have to value teachers more and help them stay on the job longer.
Absolutely.
You know, in what I totally agree with what you're talking about, David. And I think part of that too is thinking about how we're recruiting future leaders. Like, we don't do a great job. I mean, we get leaders into our programs because a teacher thinks they might want to be a leader. Is that really the best way for us to select our leaders in our classrooms? And it makes me think of my husband, who is a practicing principal, who never thought that principaling was a gig that he wanted to do. He actually chose that profession because I was getting my degree in principal leadership, and he was like, who would want to do that? I mean, like, he just never thought of it. But then as time went by, there were people who said to him, you should do this because you have these qualities. You would be really great at this. You're responsive to kids, just a lot of those things, and encouraged him to get his degree. And, but do we do that enough? Are we recruiting people, and who's doing that? What's our part of that in higher ed, in helping to identify those people that we think will be good, who may not even think about being principals, who may not think about that development. How can we be, we could definitely be diversifying leadership more if we're, out there, and we're supposed to be the ones in higher ed who know what are the, what's going to make these great candidates? How are we going to build them into this? But what's our part in that? How are we helping to select those people and encouraging them to become leaders? I don't know that we're doing that right now, and I think we could do a better job of it.
David added in the chat that one thing that they do at UT Austin is connect with all of the alumni who are in leadership roles and ask them to nominate teachers they believe could be effective leaders in the future. And that's outstanding, using those networks that are already established. A couple other comments, Sarah. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's right. Because I think, I think to some degree, we still have to confront the existing myth of a super leader. And it's sort of like, one when you see one kind of thing, right? As opposed to thinking about developing a set of skills, highlighting dispositions that we know are better for children, and that it can exist in multiple places at once. And so I think sort of rethinking the way that, again, the way that schools and the way that we prepare principals for schools that are still very much sort of, quote unquote, the man in the office, right? I think that's something that we need to unpack a lot more, both in K-12 and in pre-K-12 and in higher ed, right? I think the other thing is really thinking about coming up with a better metaphor than a pipeline. People who know me know that I don't like the pipeline metaphor.
That's why I use pathway.
Pathways is so much, because in some of the early work that I did with colleagues a while back now, a lot of, and our work was in Latino leaders, Latinx leadership. A lot of them begin their pathway as teacher aides. And a lot of them begin their educational trajectory in higher education through community colleges. And so are there opportunities there that we're not looking at because we think a teacher has to have that 4 or 5 year program that then leads to, we have this very set pipeline into, which of course influences what happens in leadership. But if we were to begin thinking about multiple pathways, multiple conversations, we could do 2 things at once. We could do many things at once. One, teacher assistants, the ones that I've worked with in New York City, know their community. You know, they are embedded in that community. They have deep roots in that community. They know community strengths as well as they know, you know, community issues. That's not something you can teach in a course, right, or in a class. You know, so issues of sustainability of teacher populations, diversifying the teacher pipeline and the principal pipeline down the road, and connecting with community colleges, I think are things that we are not exploring enough.
Absolutely, absolutely. And those, not only are they embedded, but they're committed and connected within those communities. All right, a couple of other comments. Sarah said, what we need to take into account is that parents and families have become a greater force in how to prepare leaders to deal with this added element. Also need to address the issues of cultural diversity for parents of English language learners. And Sarah, I hope you will tune in for the rest of our series because those are upcoming topics. We absolutely agree with you on that. Helene shared information about Secretary Cardona hosting a major address tomorrow at 10:30 Eastern on the U.S. Department of Education YouTube channel. This agenda speaks specifically to supporting educators and students in education challenges and successes that have resulted from the pandemic. Sandra said she loves the idea of thinking of birth to 20 system focused on being faithful to the human. She dreams of a system that will build on individual strengths, knowing every person by name and strength, breaking and calling out the deficit patterns encrusted in our systems for our marginalized, underserved students, teachers, and leaders that need us most. Let's see. Thomas commented on an earlier part of our discussion saying individual schools and school systems need to make more deliberate efforts to identify and nurture those teachers who demonstrate leadership potential based upon their service records. And Sharday noted in the Q&A pod related to that, wants to know how we work to ensure that practitioners who provide related services, such as school psychologists or therapists, are included in the system model and are able to collaborate. So I don't know if you all in your programs speak to that in your coursework or in your preparation activities. I know in one of the courses that I've taught here, we encourage the students as a part of one of their projects to collaborate with a related service provider in their school, so that that's not something brand new to them once they become teachers of record. So I don't know, other thoughts?
One of the things I did as an administrator, and that I have my students who are aspiring administrators look into, and is how, if at all, do their principals even connect and check in with related service providers. And so something that I did as an administrator was we had regular meetings where we discussed our entire agenda. We looked over the provision of services, progress monitoring, any upcoming meetings that we needed to plan. And something that I've consistently found when as an instructor is that few schools have any sort of management effort on the principal's part in just making sure everyone who's in the building working with students with disabilities are connected, that there's some oversight, and that there's open lines of communication between general ed, special ed, and related service providers to support kids. That had a big effect for me, and I just so rarely see it happen. And when I do see really effective inclusive schools, I see principals or somebody taking that coordination effort on. So I think we need to really prioritize that in our programs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what you're talking about, David, is the same systems that we're talking about at a national level. You know, like how often do we come into states and people are just, these systems are not talking to each other? How many of our own faculties do we not? In our own universities, is the leadership department talking to elementary ed? Are they talking to special ed? We don't talk to each other, you know, and then we expect our principals to go out there and create that culture in their schools. You know, we all definitely have to do a better job of getting out of our silos and communicating and collaborating. But I hear you talking about it. It makes me happy.
All right, Diana added a question. How do you support current principals who are doing a good job, but are burning out and wanting to leave the profession? What specific coaching skills do you employ? Not in an effort to keep them if they truly don't want to be kept, but in an effort to support them if they want to stay, but are having trouble working through the extra heaviness and the present role of a school leader.
I don't want to talk too much, but this has been a big emphasis of mine. So I want to say just a few things that I think are really important. And the first thing, I'm not a medical doctor, but it's pretty easy to read this research. We have to encourage people to sleep. You cannot function in any role if you're not getting sleep. And I think one of the biggest contributors to burnout is folks just not prioritizing their own sleep. And you can't treat sleep like a vacation. Like you work crazy and then you take you sleep on the weekends. Like that doesn't help you, doesn't prepare you for day to day. And so I think the first thing is just raising that issue with people as much as you possibly can. I also think principal coaching is going to be really important in making sure principal coaches understand self-care, understand healthy, proactive coping strategies. There's a large literature on that. The role of time management and principals having time where they're not supposed to be working and them having to set boundaries. It doesn't mean they can't work really hard, but they need to learn to set some of those boundaries. And then something I consistently find as a coping strategy that principals report as helpful is having a cohort, whether it's part of your feeder pattern that you're connected with and supervised through an associate superintendent or folks you go to school with, but having a professional network of peers that has time and opportunity that's unstructured for folks to vent, to talk, to offer support, to provide feedback. And so I think those things are really, really important for pushing back burnout and stress and allowing principals to sustain their jobs and hopefully find joy in their jobs. And that's the one other thing that balances burnout and stress is compassion satisfaction. Feeling good that you make a difference in your job helps you persist and find joy. And so also recognizing the principal supervisors, recognizing the important work that principals are doing.
And the only thing I would add to what David said, and I'm going to keep repeating to myself, sleep, Monica, sleep, because, but, it's sort of, reconnecting or not reconnecting, because that seems you've been disconnected, but to think about the things that make you happy. What creative things make you happy? I've been in conversation with several of my colleagues around, one took up quilting during the pandemic. One wrote poetry but stopped. One used to dance and doesn't anymore. And so, throughout our professional careers, we seem to think that those things that are creative somehow can be are negotiable. And so actually we, at our last UCEA convention, we had an art salon, which was just unstructured creative time. And we had sticky notes and paints and all kinds of stuff. And it was a wonderful session because it was quiet murmur and then laughing. And then at the end, we had these beautiful things to show each other. And so, not underestimating the importance of creativity and the relationship of creativity to leadership. That leadership is in many ways an expression of that sort of creativity. And if we don't pay enough attention to that part of our natures, we may be, not doing something really important in our leadership.
I spoke with one, I call them my baby teachers. She's a full grown adult, many years teaching experience, a family of her own, but she calls me periodically to let me know how she's doing. And she started an assistant principal position. And she said, how do I do it all? I said, well, first of all, stop trying to do it all. Think about all of the aspects of your life and what you need to hold dear, what's going to sustain you, and set boundaries, just like you all are talking about. And she said, well, I've been doing it for 3 months. I feel like I should have it together by now. I said, oh, no, honey. Give yourself at least a year, maybe 3 years before you feel like you can integrate your life in a way that feels good. But not to be so hard on ourselves. All right, a couple of other comments that I hope that we have some time to get to. They were really interesting. Stacy said it would be great if our leadership programs also included a focus or discussions and content related to leaders' intersectional identities and how that impacts leadership experience and perceptions. Portland State University here in Oregon has a fantastic summer institute each year called New Leadership Oregon, designed for women in and pursuing leadership positions, but not exclusive to education. One of our next One of the other installments in our series will discuss intersectionality. So we'll look at teachers, students, as well as leaders, and how those social identity markers that David mentioned earlier show up in our work and can help us to thrive or be challenges or opportunities for us. Annette said, I work with a university that is embedding restorative practice, not restorative justice, into their elementary ed and health enhancement teaching programs. Many benefits to valuing human capital first, seeing dramatic shifts in their pre-service candidates on how they engage with all aspects of their program, easing the stress they had as faculty, being the trusted sounding board for their students, and many more positives. I will be hopeful that if any of these pre-service candidates choose to go into a principal's role down the road, they would approach this leadership from the heart first. We have to remember our why. Sade said, an additional issue we're dealing with here in Miami-Dade, a large urban district, is that principals are frequently moved when the school shows large improvements. This makes it virtually impossible for schools to maintain a successful school system. David, I think you spoke to that a little bit earlier. You want to say any more there?
Yeah, so related to burnout, I also look at turnover and just finished a big study using 10 years of Texas data with some colleagues, and it's absolutely an issue. We have to raise with district folks that first of all, change takes time, and that change needs to be sustainable. And so progress doesn't necessarily lead to sustainability. So making sure principals are in their place for 5 or 6 years, and that when they leave, there is an appropriate transition, I think is critical to creating and sustaining and improving inclusive schools. And unfortunately, what we see, and it's to be expected, that students that serve minority students that serve low-income families, rural schools and urban schools in particular, they tend to have higher rates of turnover. That creates higher rates of teacher turnover, which causes a decline in achievement. And it just makes creating the systems and the change even more difficult. So that's an issue, I think. To me, it's probably the most pressing equity issue, because it's hard to make other equity-oriented reforms when staff and leadership is turning over.
Absolutely. Okay, for those of you who are interested in the article, David added his email address in the chat. You can send him an email so he can make that accessible to you. I won't read what he wrote, but he will make that article accessible to you if you are interested. I'm going to transition us back to the PowerPoint. Thank you all for engaging, just so that we can share some resources before we reach the end of our time together. And so, Monica, you want to share these?
Sure. I mean, I think, number one at the top of my list was, sort of re-engaging with CEDAR and really trying to find not just, collaborations, but partnerships that could be, I'm looking at the gray states, on the map that you shared, Megan, and I'm just like, oh, well, we've got UCEA institutions in some of those, right? So really kind of thinking through that. I think the sensitivity that this conversation and everything that's happened up until now, really thinking about, we're developing a new preparation program survey to sort of as a self-assessment for programs related to the standards, but standards plus. And I think part of the plus is, ideas and concepts and around inclusive leadership, I think is going to be, sort of front in our minds as we continue to develop that. I think to some degree too, I think we need to unpack or not unpack, I hate that word, but sort of, dig a little deeper into the NELP standards, the same way that David talked about with CCSSO and the PCEL standards, really sort of digging a little deeper into the NELP standards and how issues of inclusivity are assumed, but need to be actually brought out. I also wanted to highlight the presidential address given by Bill Black this past convention is a really powerful, just, I don't even know, sharing of the role of ableism and leadership. It's both personal and highly theoretical. It's a beautiful thing to listen to. So I'd really recommend that you give that a listen. And then some of our colleagues are coming out with a new book in this year, specifically looking at issues of, well, power, disability, and educational leadership. And so the book is not out yet. When it is, I will make sure to let Erica and Meg know so that they can, push that out as well. And just really looking forward to continuing this conversation. I think it's important that we all be kind of, I asked someone yesterday to be my conscience. So I think it's important that we be each other's consciences in this work.
Thank you. Cedar Center also has a number of resources available on our website. Most probably important for this group is the High Leverage Practices in Special Education Professional Development Guide for School Leaders. You can go to cedar.org. And we also have a number of other resources on our website and on Inclusive Principal Leaders, the CCSSO microsite. If you have any trouble finding any of these resources, please do reach out to us. We are happy to make sure that you can get to those. So resource recap, here are a few of those websites: CCSSO Inclusive Principals Guide.org, cedar.org, highleveragepractices.org, and UCEA.org. Our upcoming topics in the series: representation matters, recruiting and sustaining a diverse and culturally responsive educator workforce, improving in loco parentis, engaging families and communities in culturally responsive ways, See All of Me, recognizing and meeting the needs of learners' intersectional identities, tapping available talent, interdisciplinary collaboration for program improvement. So be on the lookout for those offerings coming soon. Thank you, David. Thank you, Monica. And thank you to Meg for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you got something out of our time together, and we look forward to communicating with you again soon.